and welcome to High Tide Theatre's digital symposium, Inventing the Future, a session in partnership with the Writers Guild, where we invite you to join us to explore in this session what anti-racism means and how it has pertinence and relevance for writers in particular. I'm Amanda Parker, Chief Exec and founder of InCarts UK, which is a national collective that champions the creative, economic and contractual rights of the UK's arts sector workforce that are ethnically diverse and have experience of racism. We work together across consultancy, research and advocacy to build inclusive creative environments. I'm thrilled to be joined today by playwright Matilda Ibini, curator Eleanor Root, producer Lian Wilkinson, and artistic director Chinenyeram Adimba. Welcome all of you. A little bit more about our panelists today. Matilda Feishayo Ibini is an award-winning bionic playwright and screenwriter of Nigerian heritage from London. Matilda was selected as a Star of Tomorrow 2020 by Screen Daily magazine and has a feature film play, screenplay in development, which featured her on the Brit List 2020. She's also an Arts Foundation Futures Award winner. As a playwright, Matilda's work has been staged by many people. I won't list all, but they include the Old Vic, Shakespeare's Globe, Royal Court Theatre, Soho Theatre, Arcola, and so many more. And she has screen projects in development with BBC Films. Eleanor Root is a curator working in collections and learning at Colchester and Ipswich Museum. She is a passionate advocate for working in inclusive spaces and working in partnership with communities, and is a self-confessed evaluation geek. Eleanor is part of the team that co-created Power Stories, The Power of Stories, an exhibition exploring how stories have the power to unite and divide us, and which feature costumes from Marvel Studios' Black Panther. Lian Wilkinson is a producer and exec producer at New Earth Theatre, which exists to support British, East Asian and Southeast Asian theatre makers. Lian is also a board member for ITC Arts. Formerly Yellow Earth Theatre, New Earth celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, and in the last 3 years has given almost 300 performances in over 40 venues to over 17,000 people. Chinenyeram Adimba is the new artistic director and chief exec of Theatre Fahodzi. She's also a playwright, a theatre director and poet, and her work for theatre has been staged at venues including Hampstead Theatre, Kiln Theatre, Watermill, and others. She's been shortlisted for several writing awards, including the Adrian Benham Award, Alfred Fagan Award, and the Bruntwood. She's also a winner of the 2018 Sonia Friedman Award for New Playwriting. Welcome all of you. Thank you for joining this fantastic discussion. I should backpedal and start with an audio description of myself. I am a Black woman with short black hair. I'm wearing a cream coloured top. All of our panelists will be doing a brief audio description when we start. So I'm going to start with an open question to all, and I'd love anyone who wants to stick their hand up and dive in. So here's the context. Artists are overwhelmed. We've had a year and a half like no other. We are facing existential crisis like no other in our living history, including climate crisis. And in the midst of all this change, the changing landscape also offers exciting new opportunities. There are new conversations to be had. There are new connections to be had. And we are very interested in exploring new allyships and opportunities. Let's talk about racism. That's what we're here for. What does the panel feel are the biggest learnings that we've had over the last year with relevance and particular relevance to writing in particular? I'd love to open it up if anybody wants to dive in. If not, I will just pick on someone. Lian looks like she's drawing breath, so I'm going to go with Lian to say, so what have we learned in the last year with particular pertinence to writers that feels to you like opportunity?
So I'll start off by describing myself. So my name's Leanne. I am a Chinese woman with glasses and long black hair. Currently wearing a grey jumper, sitting in a beige armchair in an office space. And I would say that the biggest lesson we've learned is that talk is well and good, and having those discussions is well and good, but the actions are still yet to come. We're making small steps, but it needs to come faster. And in the past year, that urgency has accelerated faster than ever before, in the realization that we just have to speed up. And with theatre being such a power change, a game changer in many ways in terms of having a collective thought and collective action, it's how do we translate what's being on stage, off the stage, and into our real lives.
So for you, there's two things that come from this: pace of change and realization that we need to get the hell on with it, and power to change, that we can see that there are opportunities to do so. Chinenyerom, can I take that to you? As a new artistic director, obviously you have the lens of writing, but you also have the lens of an organization. What key learnings do you feel are useful for us to hang on to during these difficult times, to go, actually, there's some good here?
I mean, first of all, I'll describe myself. I'm a dark-skinned Black woman. My hair is in plaits. I'm in a bun on the top of my head, and I'm wearing glasses and a dark blue navy top. And my background is very much just plain white ceiling. Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult because obviously we need to look at the positives, and we need to look at how we move forward from this moment. But I think that the two words for me that absolutely are key to both the work I'm doing in Theatre for Hornsey at the moment and in the relationship that we're creating with artists, and we do serve artists of British African heritage as our primary focus, is the word honesty. And I feel like where we've lost our way as an industry, and in terms of our relationship with writers, is about going back to those really integral values that we should keep at the heart of what and everything that we do. So those values include honesty, include justice, and include an equilibrium in terms of power. And those are the three key drivers for me as an artistic director, but they're also the key drivers for me as myself, also having spent 18 years working as a freelance writer and knowing the industry from that point of view. And I don't think that by talking about those things, we move away from anything that isn't positive, that isn't about the future. But we cannot have a conversation about change until we have an honest conversation. And that honest conversation has to include really being aware of who has gained from the system as it was before. We have to have a conversation about justice in terms of why we have allowed a certain level of injustice to occur and who has gained from that injustice. And we also have to have a conversation about how we shift power, because I think this is one of the hardest conversations. And certainly the work that people like Susanna Lane have been doing in terms of talking about power is crucial to this, because power sits at everything that we are talking about. And in order for things to change, people have to A, be up for giving up their power, but B, we then have to empower artists to take up those positions. And we have to empower artists to find the language to defend themselves, their culture, and their work. And so for me, there is a language of power that we all need to find, every single one of us. But there's also a language of power of relinquishing power. And this is, for me, the crux of what has been holding back some of the ways in which I do believe as an industry we can move forward. I do believe as an industry we can truly support and nurture not just new talent, but existing talent, because we are also one of the biggest talent drainers in this, in the kind of the global idea.
I think it's been really interesting to see how the shift in understanding from equality and inclusion to equity, inclusion and inclusion has been acknowledged. I'm wondering, and I'm pausing on whether it's been gone beyond the acknowledgement, but certainly there is a wider understanding that we need not talk about equality, we need to talk about equity. Matilda, as a writer, Chinyere has laid quite a pile of gauntlets at your feet. What does anti-racism look like as a creative, as she said, needing to find a new language to talk about power, needing to find a new language to talk honestly about who's benefited? What has anti-racism meant in your personal practice, and what learnings have you had that you feel are useful to share to emerging writers?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly audio describe myself. I'm a Black woman in her late 20s. I have short black braids, wearing glasses and wearing a black and white top, and my background is just a bedroom. Yeah, I feel like Chino said so many things of like, she articulated so many of my thoughts and feelings through this pandemic, and particularly the one about honesty that really struck a chord with me, because I feel like I had to come to terms with the reality and the honesty that theatre as a writer is not sustainable, that I was not making a living just as solely as a playwright, and that it was nearly impossible. And it was it was not just difficult, but at times traumatic, that I'm pursuing this career and making or realizing in the pandemic, I'd made all these sacrifices for something that wasn't even going to sustain me in the first place. And one of the things I feel like I learned was, okay, I'm not just a playwright, I'm a storyteller. So what does that look like? What could that look like in my work then? That actually I know how to tell stories. I can tell stories for the stage. That means hopefully some of those skills I can build upon, stretch, adapt to tell stories in other mediums that might be a bit more sustainable, because if I stick to playwriting, I am going to have to leave this industry eventually, because it's simply not financially sustainable. And actually that's always been the way, because the people who could afford to live just as playwrights are a particular demographic of people. And that meant their work could get on because they could stick out not being paid for very long periods of time, which is simply not possible for me, especially as a disabled person. So you asked what anti-racism looks like in my work. Not even just in my work, in my life, it feels constantly having to interrogate things, that having to look at struggles or obstacles I'm facing and like think, is it me? Am I the problem? Like I had to really interrogate, because there's so much that I've internalized unknowingly about the way one should live, about the way one should exist, the way one would pursue a career in writing, that are so like racist and ableist and sexist. And so I felt like through this pandemic, I've been doing a lot of unlearning and realizing there are other ways to pursue this career that are more holistic. There are other ways to pursue this career that isn't at the detriment of my mental health. There are other ways to exist in this world that isn't based on the narratives I've been fed about what it means to be Black, or what it means to be disabled, or what it means to be a woman or a queer person. There's been so much interrogation that I've not even that if the pandemic hadn't happened, I don't think I would have ever had the time to really process, to really question things a lot more, question how these systems and institutions that are purposefully invisible are forcing me down these paths that are not safe or beneficial to not just my career as a writer, but to my life.
There's a lot you've put out there. Carving out the time, I think that is a very important thing to land, given where we are and given that the writing community is, like many other communities, not just in the sector but elsewhere, in a place of trauma. We are still in a place of traumatic recovery. Carving out the time is what I'm going to offer to everyone listening to this from what you've just said. But also, I'm really interested that you have, without using the word vocation, you've articulated the difference between vocation, profession, and career, because you've talked about the privilege that comes with writing and the old guard, where you could treat it as a vocation. You didn't have to get paid because, you know, trust fund, whatever it might be. You've talked about your professional skills, but what a bombshell to land, people, that you say, I have a profession that is not financially sustainable. I think that's something that we really need to think about. And so you have, thinking about yourself as a storyteller, thinking about the other stories that we tell, which almost perfectly cues Eleanor as a voice from the wider cultural sector, not just in theatre and playwriting, but Eleanor, you have had experience building exhibitions around story. Tell us a bit more about that, and specifically, what can we learn about inclusive best practice from that exhibition and more your work more widely?
Thank you. So to start with an audio description, I'm a white woman in a black cardigan with a cobweb design and a floral headband, sat on a grey chair, and behind me to my left are some bookshelves and a white wall to my right. So a bit of context, I guess. Before I said yes to joining this panel, I thought about what I might be able to bring that would be useful for writers and within the kind of broader theatre sector. And I realised actually we're really similar. We focus on telling stories. All good museum displays are about weaving a narrative that creates an empathy pathway for people to understand someone else better or themselves better. And that's all we're really doing. So I think there's this massive overlap. And I think what I see that the pandemic has maybe given us, and all of the things that happened that were traumatic and challenging, and I think shifted the world, was that there is a shift in the belief that stories by storytellers of colour, whatever that storytelling looked like, whether that's writing, novels or plays or displays, would only ever be of interest to a minority, has changed. So one of the reasons we chose to display the Black Panther costumes is that film in 2018 went in at the 8th highest grossing film of all time at the international box office. And it was believed before that film, before Black Panther, that a predominantly Black cast could never be an economic success, that it simply wasn't viable. And this film by Marvel blew that out the water. It just proved that it was racist nonsense, that people thought. It's like they've never heard of the Cosby Show or the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'm just saying. Dude, so this idea that you could never make a massive film with a Black cast and it be successful was really believed in Hollywood. And what Black Panther did was change that. And I think we are seeing those ripples in the stories that we can tell. And I think you asked me about what best practice looks like, and I think often for white professionals, it means getting out the way and doing the administrative work. So when we talk about, and I'm particularly addressing this to the white people listening, if you want to be a good ally, you need to do the administrative work, the hard work, support people with funding, and then allow people to be brilliant and pass that space over. And that's what we've seen in our exhibition, which is called The Power of Stories, appropriately enough for this conversation, in Ipswich, is that we listened and tried to make space, and it is better than it could have been. Frankly, if we had to try to curate it ourselves as a museum, it would have been a group of white women trying to curate an exhibition about what it means to be Black. And what
about that process, because that's very interesting, the involvement of community as a strategy for anti-racist action.
So I think it's there are pros and cons. So we approached it by, we just tried to open the doors and start conversations with everyone that could listen, that we could reach, everyone that might listen to us. We went through contacts of contacts. It was pre-COVID, so we went to cafes and just kind of set up shop and said, we're here, come and talk to us. We asked people to make introductions. We tried to stick by our word. When we said we'd do something, we tried to follow through, because museums have a history of making promises and then letting people down, using people to justify funding. So saying, aren't we brilliant? We're working with this group of Black teenagers, so you should give us money, and then just dropping that group of people as soon as they've stopped being useful for funding purposes. And we had, and are still working to unpick that, and unpick the damage that we have inflicted on our incredible local communities. We invited people to become curators with us, and that started in real life. So we had conversations in real life before it moved to Zoom. So we curated it with 6 members of our community. They were not paid, and I recognise that that is exploitative, and we won't work in that way again. So if there are white-led organisations, I think one of the pieces of best practice is you have to have your budget ready to go to demonstrate to people that you take their expertise and their experience seriously. And I was, in preparation for this, I read a quote that is often attributed to Martin Luther King, but apparently he didn't say it. It gets attributed to him, that your budget is a moral document. And I think that's probably one of the clearest bits of advice for best practice, that if you really mean what you're saying about supporting artists of colour, creative people, your local community of African, Caribbean, dual heritage that we have been working with Descent, you pay them for their time and for their energy, because people shouldn't be asked to do this for free.
So I really love it when some of the ideas that InCarts are putting out seem to have real synergy with organisations, and that is one of them, because that goes to the heart of one of our recommendations that we have put out, which is a 1% challenge for organisations to dedicate 1% of each budget line to ethnic inclusion in all sorts of ways, which builds up to be a phenomenal amount. 1% a month, 12% a year on each budget line kind of starts building. You get what I mean. But what I take from what you said are a sustained approach to community engagement is super important, in addition to the financial remuneration and acknowledgement of skills and sustaining those skills beyond the project itself. What's important is a sustained approach to community engagement. And just going to Leanne now, that feels very pertinent to what you and others have done in working up the anti-racism rider, because we're not just talking about an external community, are we? We're talking about the internal community of the creative and cultural profession and how we engage with other communities, the wider society beyond that. Can you tell us a bit about the anti-racism rider and what that says about inclusion?
If I can find the unmute button, I will do. Yeah, it's one of those, it is one of those realizations when we're talking about in the theatre context, that you'd like to think that plays are welcome at any theatre in any location. The idea that theatre can is such a human phenomenon, really, that it will connect with everyone. And just thinking about touring, thinking about how vulnerable it is taking a group of people week on week to a new location, having to adapt and know where to go, what to do, what's just facilities, what's out there, it can be quite a scary part of the job in many ways. And the idea that some plays aren't welcome and some companies and some people aren't welcome in certain areas is something that we wanted to address and tackle very much at visiting company level and venue level. The feeling that it's not an individual concern, it is something that really encompasses the entire sector. And so way back in summer last year, when there was, with the rise of Black Lives Matter, with the murder of George Floyd, it was, there was an explosion really of words of solidarity, of the Black squares, of realizing that, you know, there's learning to be done. And quickly, those words needed to be turned into practical action. And a group of touring theatre companies were meeting regularly and thought, we're having similar thoughts. Where are these? Where are we collecting this information, and where are we sharing it? And at the same time, there was a manifesto written by a group of freelancers called A New Normal, a manifesto to create safe spaces free of racism for the Black artist. And what it very much called upon was having a document of practical actions to make touring safer and anti-racist. So coordinated and led by Amanda Huxtable, English Touring Theatre, Newer Theatre and High Tide, that with consultation from freelancers, from venues and from companies, we wanted to give a list of suggestions that really bring the baseline, it's suggestions and baseline expectations when you're touring, to when you're taking a tour on taking a production on tour, from the moment that the show is scheduled to go into a theatre, so what preparations are needed before getting to that theatre, to when those company members are in place, whether that including the digs situation, so accommodation where people are staying, what information is conveyed and when, and how to make people feel welcome. And that can be as simple as making sure that you're pronouncing names correctly, and bringing in headshots so that people can recognise when you're an actor or when you're a stage manager in a new venue. It's online. We've got a website, www.antiracismtouringrider.co.uk, and what is on there is not only the rider with the accessible versions as well, but there's also a checklist, and what really shows is that the checklist is there to show the responsibilities of the touring company and what they can be doing to support the company members, and the actions from the venue side. And what's really pertinent is that it's not a one-sided request at all. It's not the touring companies asking the venues, you need to do better. It's very much a shared objective and a shared goal, and we can all be doing things to not only hit the baseline but improve upon that.
I love the rider, you know I do, and it does feature in our unlock, because we absolutely looked at all of those manifestos and went, where are the actions, what are the measurable things that people can do? And there it was already ready for us when it came to theatre and touring, so thank you very much. I'd be really interested, maybe not for today, but I'm really interested in what engagement you're having, if you know, with theatres on that. I'd love to know, as touring returns, how people are taking that up. Are people going into digs and going, I'm really interested. I mean, tell me if it's not appropriate to now. If you do have those figures, I'd love to know.
I think the figures will come at a later date. So it was launched officially in June this year. And through conversations and just feedback from companies and venues that have used it before, it's been a very positive response. There is certainly the conversations around the time needed to implement things, and the cost, expenses and the planning in place and so forth. And we're very much there for seeing those issues taking place. How do you put in training when there hasn't been a budget before, etc. But what was so important for having the rider was having that, not only that stamped commitment, as it were, but also having inactions and the commitments to have that as a priority for so many years, to be able to put that in place, very much so in the spirit of the Ink Arts Unlock toolkit, which we also absolutely adore. Having those marks in place so that it's not we love this in principle, but it's still theoretical.
The articulation of the action that's needed is the first step that is super important. And you raised the point about responsibility, that this is it's not a transactional one-way transaction, it's a dialogue. And I want to come to Chinenyeram again, because as a leader, as a creative leader, you and as a playwright in your own right, you have both hats on in this conversation. As an organization, Leanne's talked about that gritty bit that comes to time and resource. And at Ink Arts, on day one, talking to an organization, we will say, just so you know, you will need to find money to do this work. You cannot build an inclusive environment without putting resource, full stop, no way around it. How do you, as a creative leader, square that circle of resourcing inclusion? Where does the responsibility land? What's the power balance of responsibilities with delivering that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because I think that certainly one of the key things that we are thinking about is that what I was talking about in terms of how you shift power and acknowledge that shift in power. And I think working as a smaller touring company, and a lot of the time working with larger organizations, I think we have to start the conversation with, you have a capacity that we don't have. That does not put us on a smaller footing, because we come with knowledge and experience that you don't have. And I think that acknowledgement from the start of any partnerships, and I've been working quite closely with my team about how we identify and also put in place values around equity in our partnerships, because so much of the work we do as a company of this size is in partnership. We work a lot with co-pros. We've done talks for artists in partnership with people like New Earth, and we're constantly striving for partnership, not just because it's a business model, but because it's absolutely the way we see as the future of how we're going to bring about change. But I think there's something about where you start those conversations, because so much of the time, people who come with a bigger resource in terms of capacity or funding tend to then need to feel that they're leading the project, tend to then need to feel that that's there where the knowledge and experience lie, and then they get in the way of the work that needs to be done.
So give us paint a picture then of your partnership with a larger organization and how that looks today.
Well, for us at the moment, yeah, we've been, since I've been in post for 6 months, and since I've been in post, one of the things that we've been looking at are these smaller workshops with organizations, in partnerships with organizations, around what conversations artists are now wanting to have. And it's been quite artist focused and quite artist led. And we did a dramaturgy town hall with New Earth, which was actually an invitation to the larger theatre companies to hear from freelance artists about what their experiences of dramaturgy have been from a largely Eurocentric model. Now, those organizations had to come to that space with Teatr Honzi and New Earth, who are considered to be the smaller of the organizations, and really put themselves in a particular position and space where artists had more power and the conversation was not about them. And I think in all of those conversations, that balance is what we're trying to find. It's like, we will not shut you out of the conversation. This isn't about us holding on to something and shutting the door or making people feel bad. That's not how we get change through.
But it's like, as Eleanor has said, it's about articulating that value, the value that the community adds to the work, whether that community is Theatre for Artsy and their engagement with a larger organisation, or whether in Eleanor's case, your engagement with your wider communities beyond the museum itself. Matilda, I want to ask you, does that feel like it's happening in your space? The provocation that Chininerum has put out around different stories and different value being recognised. Do you feel like, as a writer, your value is seen more appropriately now?
That's a tricky one. I feel like I'm not sure it is in the wider I want to say externally, I'm not sure it is, but internally, I've had that change. I've had that feeling of realizing that it's almost like I am not just my work, if that makes sense, that I've had to find, especially in this pandemic, that I've had to rediscover like what my voice means and what I want to do with it. And therefore the stories that I want to put my energy behind. It's made me more like, I guess, not picky, but I guess more selective about the projects I agree to be a part of, because I want to make sure that it aligns with my own values and the stories that I want to put out into the world. So, but I can't say that I've seen that yet, and especially because I've not been physically in a theatre for close to 2 years now, and won't be for a while.
But actually, as a writer, I mean, again, picking up Gino's point, that as a writer, you are articulating your own value in choosing what you align with, rather than, and forgive me, I have no idea whether you feel that you've ascribed to this in the past, but there has so often been writers going, gosh, this doesn't exactly fit with my values, but boy, I am trying to sustain a living, or it does give me another credit, or it does put me in front of an agent, or it does, you know, the other reasons. So do you feel that you've changed that in that?
Yeah, definitely, because I was in that position pre-pandemic, and very early on in my career, I would write to briefs, or I would write to a commission, even if I wasn't 100% sure, like, am I sure this is what I want to do or want to be a part of? Because I was trying to build experience or what have you. And it felt like, I guess when the pandemic happened, I felt like I'd lost the sense of myself. Like, what stories do I want to be telling? And what drives me? What do I want to be using my voice for? And I felt I'd lost a sense of that.
And writing to commission, to somebody else's commission or opinion of ethnicity in particular, and disability, then leads to those weird shonky characters that nobody believes in.
yeah, definitely.
But is it a Black woman? Yeah.
I definitely had those experiences, and I to some extent, I almost feel like I needed to as well, to be able to get to this point, to realize, like, to rediscover, oh, these are the stories I'm interested in telling. These are the people I will work with. I feel like I'm learned to use my voice in a way that's not just to tell stories, but to also like protect my peace, that I don't want to have to make those sacrifices that I made earlier on in my career. Those are non-negotiable now. I don't want to do that. And actually, I'm being very selective about who I work with, how, but also putting my mental health, putting my life first, that actually I cannot suffer for the sake of telling stories, that actually my life and then the requirements of my life have to always come first. But I'll be honest, that wasn't always the case pre-pandemic.
And I want to turn to Eleanor now to go, what are the other elements we could learn and take into the space from working with communities? Because that is very pertinent. There are some pockets that are very mindful of, excuse the pun, of good mental health well-being. And certainly in CARTS, again, one of the unlock conditions is that you provide mental health resource to individuals just to call on. And I am amazed to hear last week that there are organisations who are not just pointing people to the free resource, which is in CARTS Minds, which is fantastic, but also putting aside budget to make sure that every staff member can avail themselves of £200 worth of counselling should they need it. Phenomenal. Offer that as an example. Eleanor, I'm really interested to go within curatorial practices in museums and archives and collections. What's the good stuff that's coming out that's really helpful for writers and in the writing environment?
Just listening to what everyone has been saying, it's really clear that so I sit within a larger organisation, and an organisation with a really long history. We've been around for Ipswich Museums has been around for nearly 200 years, and our collections are based in colonialism. Those objects, a lot of those objects, I should say, are in Ipswich because they were taken from colonial expeditions in Africa. They come from sometimes looting, taken under duress or given as gifts under duress. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing is and agree with is the importance of integrity and acknowledging your organisation. So you're not asking smaller companies or freelancers or individuals to work with you on your terms if those terms are contrary to their beliefs. And I think one of the things that I find really moved and inspired by is organisations, museums, and I think probably happening elsewhere, but I just happen to know about museums, is valuing other ways of knowing and seeing value in decentering Western white academic approaches that value order and taxonomy and filing of individuals and people into systems to humanizing, and using our museums and the stories that we can tell and the stories that we can all tell as a seed bank of ideas for change, and not asking people to fit in with our existing practice, I guess, and to create space for challenging that. And I think, again, as a white person, you were really used to your way of doing things being seen as the right way in Britain and in Europe and in lots of places in the world. You grow up with it and you don't really ever get confronted with your whiteness. And I don't think there is a substitute for, again, hello, if you're listening and you're white, you doing that work yourself, using the privilege that comes with being white to challenge people in organisations that you work with, because your voice will carry more weight and it will go further. And if you get in trouble, it just means that you're doing a good job.
So there's a challenge that I'd like to pick up with Leanne and Chinno again, because from an organisation perspective and thinking about writers in particular, what we're hearing today is from Matilda and Eleanor, the need to give agency, or to give the space for the agency that writers have, the power that it gives a writer to go, actually, I know my stuff, I know what I need to do, I'm focusing on that. Fantastic. Here we have the interface with organizations, looking at you, Leanne, and New Earth and what you do, looking at you, Chinno and TSFHC. When you come to audiences, is there any rub, or is it quite easy to make that transition to go, actually, now we're doing this stuff because actually this is the stuff that these writers want to do? How and where do we connect with audiences in this new narrative of inclusion and agency? What does that look like?
should I start? I mean, it's a quite hard question, because I think one sense, a lot of it lies in what I started talking about and the work we've been doing together as partner organisations around dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is a huge part of this conversation in terms of writers and writers from global majority heritage, because the way in which our stories are filtered through the system and the ways in which those stories are then received by audiences absolutely starts from that relationship with the theatre, and the theatre being able to defend a writer's work.
Yeah.
And that writers feel empowered to know when their work is not being defended, and when in fact it's being attacked by all sorts of ideals that are sitting within Eurocentric ideas of what good theatre is. So we certainly at Theatre are doing quite a lot of work, and I'm doing quite a lot of work about empowering writers to know what that feels like, to know where the harm is, and to start to find a language to change and to reverse that harm and to ask for that justice. But also, I think equally with artists, I think there's another conversation where recently I've got a show that's on tour called Black Love, and it's a show we are touring in association with Payne's Plough and Belgrade Theatre. And I got a review of the show, and the review was effectively saying, you know, I'm used to work that puts me at the centre of the work and that makes me feel okay about race, and this work is uncomfortable because it doesn't do that.
Boo, boo to you. How dare you?
Yes. So, and I love that review, because it's absolutely the thing that the work is meant to do. So again, I'm all for empowering artists and writers at the moment as a person and as a company. And so I go, if you come to me and say, I want to write a play, and I want to write a play for this audience, I want this play to speak to this audience, then we as a company want to champion that to happen. But also alongside that, we've got to do, it's like we're an ecosystem, right? We're an ecosystem, and within that ecosystem, there are various levels of creating and facilitating. And some of that ecosystem at the moment is not being looked at closely enough. So actually, audiences will respond to reviews, because that's the current ecosystem and the values we put on work. So if our reviewers are still being narrow-minded, are still not having the same kind of EDI training, are still not being asked to look at their own biases, then it doesn't matter how much work we do up to that point. If we hit the point of a review where they go, oh gosh, this work was uncomfortable, therefore I don't understand it, therefore no one's going to understand it, therefore it should not exist. You know, and I've had reviews in very polite ways that have pretty much said that. So
wouldn't it be fantastic if you had the review that said, this work's uncomfortable, makes me feel really difficult, not sure if I understood it, 5 stars.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be amazing.
That your discomfort and your lack of understanding makes you want to go and do the work on yourself, rather than trying to judge a piece of work because it exists in a way that doesn't suit you. And equally, you know, we've got to increase the numbers of global majority reviewers, because equally, as I say that, there was a review that came out of the play, and honestly, the review had words I didn't understand. It was so intelligent. It was so deep. Like, I was like, is this, they talking about my play? Because, you know, and that's like, we need to, I think what we're talking about a lot of the time is that if we focus on one area, we lose the perspective that we are part of an ecosystem. And, you know, so yeah, I'll pass the ball to Leanne, because I think that it'd be great to hear what New Earth are doing.
No, certainly I'm going to pick up on the idea of the ecosystem, because it is such a fundamental kind of element to the sector. The fact that not only do, you know, theatre companies, freelance artists exist within this much bigger realm that includes publicists, reviewers, marketeers, and so forth. But it's also that feeling of like you're just not one particular section at all. A freelance artist is also an audience member, is also a participant to facilitate workshops and so forth. And actually, it's when you start helping one, you'd hope it will feed into the other, but at the same time, it's then the demand really that actually we need to be working across the board, because it's all well and good creating these amazing plays for the different people who you wouldn't see on stage, or you wouldn't consider would belong on stage, you know, previously 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so forth. But when it comes to marketing the show and not having that language, not having that understanding, that message is not going to get across. From New Earth's perspective, one of the programs that we run is the Professional Writers Program. So having had our New Earth Academies, which is very much about introduction to acting and now writing, and also off stage, our Professional Writers Program is there for writers to have a 2-year program of training, of courses, and a seed commissioned to create their own stories. And then for New Earth, after that program, having that commitment to putting those stories on stage. So not having what's the words? Being able to bring a writer's idea that's their own kind of seed of an idea into full life on a stage, and having that process in its entirety. And for us, the thing that we're very conscious of is being able to communicate that to the venues we tour to, having a meeting with marketeers and actually being able to have a conversation around, you know, new writing is one of the big things to plug, and that's a very obvious thing, but what are the themes in that play? What does it actually mean? And having that background, and that, whether that's a cultural lexicon, whether that's historical background and so forth, that's just as important as the words in the scripts.
So I want to, for the next few minutes, give the audience, who there's a large number of writers, emerging writers and established writers in the audience, I want us to create a kind of knapsack of stuff that they can use going forward, given where we started and where we are in the conversation. So I'd like you to imagine what you are going to offer or put into that knapsack that's going to make the writers that are listening to this conversation stronger. The holistic response that you talked about, Matilda, the holistic engagement with your work and your life and joining those up. What are you going to put in that knapsack that's going to help writers of the future emerge not just stronger, but have more traction and have sustainable careers? So I am looking around the room. I'm giving you time to think about what's going in the knapsack. Eleanor looks like she's writing something down. So I might start with Eleanor.
Didn't get as far as writing something down, but I was, I guess I was thinking of being brave, and that if you don't see your story that you want to tell in the world, it doesn't mean that it's not valid. It means that you could be the first person to bravely tell it. And we need lots more stories told in lots of different ways. And I think if we have learned anything from the Black Lives Matter movement, is that the diet that we're fed of one kind of story from one kind of probably white man, it makes us quite ill, and it twists our view on the world into something that it isn't. And you could be the thing that changes that. and to come to your local museum. We've got all kinds of interesting things that you could use as inspiration, and we're quite friendly.
Well, that's nice. You've actually given stimulus. You've given an idea stimulus and a confidence boost. So I'm all about the outcomes. I'm going to Matilda.
Yeah, I was just trying to think, how do I sum up some of my thoughts? I feel like an awareness. I often think as writers, or not even just as writers, sometimes like tackling subject matter or unlearning unhelpful narratives, the level of awareness one needs is like breathing, and that we go through our life often not noticing our breath, but to have the level of awareness where you notice not only your breath, but someone else's breath as well. Know that there is room. If there's anyone telling you there's not enough room to tell your story, or there's not enough room on the stage, or there's not enough stages, that's a lie. There is more than enough room on this massive planet that holds, what, 9 billion last checked people. There is more than enough room to tell your story. And you may not believe in yourself just yet, but that's a temporary feeling. So keep going when writing. That sometimes the ideas that we have or are inspired by don't automatically translate very clearly on the page, but have faith that you'll get there, that this is the beginning of a journey with that story. And don't be surprised if you, in the telling of that story, it changes you. So keep the faith and keep aware.
Yeah, so I think I've had a bit longer to think about it. Thanks, Eleanor and Matilda. I guess that, you know, in the true Chino spirit, I'd probably put a placard sign in your rucksack that said, "You need me more than I need you," as a really loud, clear message to the whole industry. But also I'd put a Tupperware of jollof rice in there as well, just to remind everyone that when you have your press night as an artist, you can demand that there is food and any other entertainment that is representative of you.
So Leanne, is that in the anti-racism tourism rider?
What, the jollof rice?
Portion of jollof rice in every dig that I stay in.
Oh, I must add it to our next edition.
I think that was missing. Leanne, what would you add?
So I'd add in the idea that started all off. So whenever you're writing a piece, there's always an inspiration, and in interviews and so forth, it's always, so what made you write this play? So having that in your knapsack, reminding you why you're writing the play, and what's pushing you through, I think is important, especially when it comes to telling people why they need to come. It's always the heart of it, which for me is the most interesting. I shall also put in the anti-racism touring rider as well, not only for the practical points that it brings across, but we wanted it to be a source of support as well. The idea that you're not alone, and everyone who signs up to it is signing up as an ally and as a support, that when you think that there's something that can be done to make touring safer, to make theatre safer and more equitable, there are others that believe in that as well.
So what we have in this bag is almost Harry Potter-like in its magic. We've got these magical glasses that give you awareness when you put them on. We've got a portion of jollof rice. We've got a sign that says, "You need me more than I need you." We've got a rider that details terms and conditions of engagement for both sides. We've got a vial of faith, a tiny vial that is infinite in size, because the more you take, the more you have. You've got knowledge. I mean, that, if that's not the TARDIS, I don't know what isn't. We've got a museum crammed in, a museum that changes size, shape, form, depending on how you need it and where you need it. And you've got the kit, the tool of bravery and breathing at your disposal. It has been a phenomenal hour to be spent with some phenomenal women. I want to thank the panel for their time, for their insight, and High Tide for hosting. And I think we're there. I don't think we can add anything to that knapsack, frankly. You had me at the jollof rice, but now we've got the anti-tourism, I always want to call it anti-tourism. We might have to change the name, the tourism rider. I'm going to stick with that, the touring rider, anti-racism touring rider. Thank you so much, everyone, for a fantastic chat. Thank you, High Tide, and thank you for listening.